I do suspect it will be almost impossible for any of us to imagine a world in which Paul Johnson is not heading up the Institute for Fiscal Studies, like the sort of amputated limb. I think we will be dialing your number before we know it. For many of us in the media, Paul is like the fourth emergency service. I mean, seriously, when we are confounded by figures, drowning in contradictory narratives, occasionally sifting through economic misinformation, Paul has brought clarity and equanimity and a really strong sense of purpose, call it public service, to this job that he's served for more than a decade. And so in many ways, I don't want to anticipate that this will be an exit interview, Paul. I don't think it will. I think it will be a stock take before we see you take to the waves with an even grander backdrop behind you and perhaps more freedom even in the months and years ahead to speak your mind. But I think this is a moment to reflect on your time at the IFS, a place you loved so much you worked there twice. Starting in 2011 as director, Paul, and when we think back, I mean, it feels like a different world. It feels like an absolutely different world, a world before Brexit, before the pandemic, before really a sort of rise of populism. But you entered at a time of austerity. That was what you found. And I wonder what you remember most from that time, you know, coming into this basically newly fledged coalition government, and you were the person that we went to and said, Paul, what's going on?
Gosh. Well, I mean, I guess I found two sets of things. One was about the IFS and some of the issues that we faced then, and some of the wonderful colleagues, many of whom are still at the IFS. I think it's one of the wonderful things is that it's so great that you know, people like Helen and Carl and many others who were there then are still here now. But in terms of the economy, yes, it was just after the financial crisis. We just had an election in 2010, which was an austerity election. I mean, both parties, but particularly the Conservatives, were not shy about coming forward and saying there are going to have to be cuts, quite different to the election last year. And they really delivered on cuts to a degree that I think many of us thought were quite surprising and possibly quite difficult to deliver. But of course, they did manage to deliver them for good or for bad. I suppose looking back, the thing that I don't think any of us really recognised, although someone yesterday told me that I did say something like this, but I don't remember it, was just how long-lasting the impact of this will be. I think we are still experiencing the consequences of the financial crisis, having had now 15 years with incredibly poor growth. You mentioned the rise of populism and so on. It's not unrelated to the fact that median earnings have barely changed in the last 17 years, that social mobility has collapsed, that wealth has become more important relative to income, and all of those things, which I think follow on fairly directly consequences of the economic slowdown post 2011. But the thing I really remember from that first year or two there was, you know, the scale of the spending cuts. And actually, a couple of years on, because the deficit wasn't coming down as quickly as expected, there was another budget where George Osborne announced that there will be a couple more years of spending cuts. And I was actually interviewed on Newsnight, where I was very excited on the day. I said something like, and 6 years is more than 4. And this got picked up on Have I Got News for You, the only time I've ever been on Have I Got News for You, in which they said it's good that we employ someone to tell us that 6 is more than 4.
That's numbers for you. And Paul, can I ask, do you ever get pulled in to advise government? I mean, do you feel that your role is sometimes an advisory one rather than an analytical one?
Well, it depends in a way what you mean by advice. We certainly talk to civil servants and ministers about our analysis and what we're thinking, and actually often have quite a lot of interaction with oppositions at various periods over time to help them understand what we're doing and how we might respond to things that they're thinking about, and to give them a little bit of an external.
I mean, who takes your advice on best?
Well, I'm not sure.
I haven't said worse. I've just said who.
I'm not
sure. Do you feel listens?
Well, I think I think people listen and understand, but of course they have political constraints. Certainly, civil servants listen and understand what we're saying. But it is really important to be clear. We are, 40 or 50 economists, of whom maybe 20 are working on this kind of broad sets of issues. And there are tens of thousands of civil servants and thousands of economists within the civil service, and whatever it is, 1,500 people in the Treasury. So the amount that I think what we can add is first of all, some sort of clarity of bringing it together. Secondly, some additional analysis. And thirdly, really importantly, is an external perspective, because one of the things I remember was really surprised by my time in the civil service is how hard it is to get that external perspective, because you're continually there's a big organisations, you're continually sort of focusing on ministerial demands or on the demands of the department, and of course the ministers. I mean, they're getting out and about in all sorts of places, but they've got very different kind of pressures on them. So I think it's worth saying to my colleagues here and others from outside government that and inside government that interaction, even if you don't feel you're telling people. There's not much we tell the Treasury that someone in the Treasury doesn't know. I mean, we hope that's the case. Occasionally is the case. But actually, that external engagement is really important to the quality of decision making, and it's very helpful to us.
Do you look back on policies or tax cuts or tax rises that you think that was our idea? That sort of came from us. Do you think you have shaped policy when you look back?
Well, there are two ways. I mean, there are different ways in which you shape policy. I mean, we know for sure, because everyone in the Treasury always tells us this, and I remember it when I was there, that that Treasury ministers feel at least somewhat constrained by what they think IFS will say. So I think a question that chancellors will often ask is, what would the IFS say about this? Or that if civil servants want to, guide them off something, they'll say, well, you might want to do that, Minister, but the IFS will say, which is a way of them not having to say it themselves. To some extent, that definitely happens to a very significant extent. I mean, there are some things where chancellors have claimed that what we've done has influenced what they've done. So, for example, when we stopped taxing returns to building society accounts, the Treasury book says that's because of what the IFS said. I'm not entirely sure whether that's wholly true. Other colleagues might be able to point to very specific examples. I think the way that policy works, it's very difficult from anyone, even inside a government department, let alone outside, to say, here's this piece of work and here's the policy that came out as a result of it, which is a long way of saying I'm confident the policy as a whole is at least a little bit better than it otherwise would have been. But can I say that this particular increase in tax or this particular change in policy was a direct result of something we did? I think it's a really hard thing to do.
What do you think has been at the heart of the organisation's success?
It's people and it's culture. It's and I'm probably going to get a bit emotional now, but my colleagues really are the most amazing group of people, both in terms of their intellect. I mean, they're just uniformly phenomenal. The culture that we have, where people work together in a really collegiate way, which may be a little different from academia, I don't know. really learn from each other, and really value the role of the IFS as an independent organisation. I mean, they've all sorts of their own different politics and so on, but actually you wouldn't know it, because we collectively understand what our role is as this kind of independent arbiter, as it were. Arbiter, I don't like that word, of policy. And the other thing which a lot of people outside of academia don't see is actually, with people like Richard leading it, the academic work at the IFS is world class. I mean, if we were a university department, we'd be one of the best university departments, and that's not even our sort of main sort of what we're mostly known for. And of course, that means that the rigor is extraordinary. So it's not just that we have the culture and the intellect and the place that we have. The rigor is absolutely not just the rigor in terms of the quality of the work, but the rigor that we use to make sure that what we then communicate is right and clear and putting across the message. But I think unquestionably it's the people who are wonderful, and actually, as I say, a lot of them have been there even longer than me, and the fantastic culture that we have.
Yeah, and that sense of continuity from you to Helen is clearly an important part of sort of you stepping away and Helen taking the reins. But if you look at the landscape now to when you started, where I began, it feels so different. If you look back now, I just want to get your sense really of what has happened to the country, I guess, since 2007, 2008, a sense of the different directions that we've travelled in.
Well, on one level, we're coming to a really hard spending review, not so different. 2011, we've got a deficit which is much higher than anyone would like. Debt's way higher than it was back then. People are talking about an austerity spending review. I don't think it really is. So there are some some similarities. But if you're the difference between particularly the period before the financial crisis and the last 15 years has been astonishing, because we had that almost 20-year period of continual growth, a sense of real optimism, I think, and that's really been sort of beaten out of the economy, and I think probably to some extent beaten out of the electorate over the last period, because not only have we had this, certainly through the up till the late 2010s, this period of really serious cuts to public services. But as I was saying earlier, no increase in people's incomes, either.
And do you think that would always have been the case after the financial crash? Or was that very much to do with the set of choices that those we elected to govern took? I mean, do you think, when we look back and say this was an era of no growth?
I think this is mostly to do with the crash. I think did austerity have an impact? It's worth looking across the rest of Europe. Most other countries did austerity on a similar kind of scale to us. Some, like Ireland and others, did on a much bigger scale. Many did more on the tax side than on the spending side. But I think some bad choices were made for sure. So big cuts in investment spending over the first half of the 2010s have had a knock-on negative effect. And some of the things this government have tried to deal with in terms of what became a more and more constrained planning system, I think had an ongoing negative effect. I think one of the tragedies in a way, and it's very hard to show that this is really true, but if you look at the economic numbers, they were beginning to get better in late 2015, early 2016, and then they just stop. Inflation goes up, real wages stop rising, and politics goes mad. And that's, the consequences of the political dysfunction after 2016, irrespective of Brexit itself. I think it's very hard to measure that effect, but you can see reductions in inward investment. You can see the reduction in the exchange rate, and you can see government really not doing very much at all of any use for that 5 years really between 2016 and 2021. I think that really wasn't, and I think had it gone 58, 52, 48 the other way, I think we might have seen the same thing, because I wouldn't have seen the Brexit.
So it was nothing to do with the result, it was to do with the paralysis that it created.
I think that's part of it, probably. It's clearly the result resulted in this big immediate reduction in the value of the pound and some of the other problems that we saw, and clearly we've then got the consequences in terms of more expensive trade. But I think economists often just understate the importance of politics in what drives economic outcomes, and I say it's very hard to quantify, but my instinct is that that's part of what went wrong over that period. And now, of course, we've got the other thing that's very different now is we had that period of really government wrestling public spending down over a decade, and it's burst out over the last 5 years. So it's post-COVID, it's ratcheted up by 5% of national income. So that's by about £150 billion. We're spending more, and that's not going to go down. And the result is also, therefore, tax going up by an awful lot over a short period. So the 2020s, I think, economic historians looking back at British economic policy, I think we'll see the 2020s as the decade in which the size of the British state changed. Tax levels as a fraction of national income over my whole lifetime and longer were basically stable, and they've gone up by 5% of national income in 6 or 7 years. That's an extraordinary change, and I think that's something we're all sort of grappling with in terms of what the impact of that is on society and the economy.
And is that a bad thing, to have a much bigger state?
Well, I think it's partly bad because part of the reason is we're paying a vast amount in debt interest. So one of the reasons that we're having to do this is we're now spending at least 1.5 times more on debt interest as we are on the entire defence budget, which people are talking about a lot. So there are some bad reasons for this, and then there are things which I think are pretty much inevitable, increased spending on health, and we're going to have to find a way of increasing spending on defence. It seems obviously an ageing population, but I think the really underlying problem has been this extraordinary lack of growth over this period. But it sort of is, it feels like we've spent a long time trying to squeeze, and it's just kind of burst out over this decade.
So when we've got the spending review this time next week, Wednesday next week, do you sort of sit there and think, I know what to do, I would know what to do, I could make sense of this? Is it frustrating? Do you backseat drive and think it's really obvious what the Chancellor's got to do on, the two-child benefit, or on, the winter fuel, or on, her commitments to tax, whatever? Is it very obvious to you what needs to be said next week?
No. No, genuinely, it's really, genuinely hard. And part of the problem is that each individual event is really tough. So if you think about this specific spending review in isolation, and what people need to really fix in their minds is that the total amount of spending is fixed. That's already been announced. So the question is, how do you distribute that between the different bits of government? And that is, there's just really hard trade-offs there. I don't think there's a correct answer as to, should you give health 3% a year growth in order to ensure that we get waiting lists coming down, with the result that most other things will get some cuts, or do you give less to health with the risk that gives to the health service? So that takes you then back to the last set of decisions, which is in the budget in late October, where what did the Chancellor do? She decided to significantly increase spending last year and increase taxes by a certain level, but that was only just enough to meet her quotes ironclad unquotes fiscal rules. And in doing that, she kind of bought herself some time, in the sense that last year essentially got rid of the strikes, and we got some pay increases and some significant increases in justice spending and local government spending and so on, which we hadn't had for a period of time, but then left herself with some really tough decisions, which she's going to have to take next week. And she also took a big gamble by leaving herself a tiny amount of room against her ironclad fiscal rules. And I think there's at least a 50% chance that we'll get to the budget in the autumn, when she's faced with the necessity of raising taxes again. So would the right answer back last October to have raised taxes more, to give herself more space, or to allow herself to spend more, or should she have been tighter? Maybe this is where, as I sort of move away from IFS and feel freer. But at the moment, I genuinely just think it's really hard, and I've genuinely got some sympathy with some of the decisions that they have to make. That said, all chancellors have made daft decisions. I couldn't believe it when she increased stamp duty in the budget. I couldn't believe it when she didn't increase, even in line with inflation, fuel duties, and politicians, chancellors past, have all failed to have a sensible tax strategy. Tax allowances up and down, corporation tax down and up, pension tax round and round and round. No one seems to know what they're doing on the tax side of things.
And what should they be doing then?
Yeah, now, how long have you got?
You're saying you wouldn't put up taxes, presumably in November and October?
I think.
Or you just start from scratch?
Well, I wouldn't start from here. And that, and again, whilst talk of oh gosh, we didn't know there was a 22 billion black hole is clearly, not entirely fair. Nevertheless, it is true that they inherited a really tough situation in which I think you did have to raise taxes if you were going to do even the relatively modest things they're doing on public services. So I wouldn't have raised employer national insurance contributions as a way of raising taxes, but then I'd probably have done things that made it even more certain I'd lose the next election. So,
And when you put ironclad in quotation marks, is that because you think that she's getting towards a place where she has to break them?
I don't think she can break them, and partly I think there's a real sort of economic issue here, which is that, as I said, one of the problems we face is we're already spending an enormous amount on debt interest, and this is not borrowing is not a free lunch. Secondly, we're barely in a world where we've got normal. The economy is not in recession at the moment, but we're barely in a world in which debt is falling over the medium term, and indeed on previous and normal definitions of debt is rising over the medium term. So these are not tight fiscal rules. The problem is that we've got such a difficult situation on tax and spending that even these really quite loose fiscal rules we're barely meeting. I think there will be economically, is there a difference between missing them and hitting them by 5 billion either way? No, of course there isn't. But in terms of the gilt markets, and don't forget we're paying a lot more for our debt than the Germans, even, for example. I think they might start to get worried if essentially at the first point of asking we resolve from this. I'd be really very surprised if we move away from them.
Do you think that the population now is more, after your 14 years at the helm, is more economically literate about what's that? I mean, do you think they understand more of what's happening inside the Treasury?
Oh God, I wouldn't have thought so. I don't know. I mean, I think it's clean. The sort of public view of the world has changed over time. So I think the Conservative, whilst we saw George Osborne getting booed at the Olympics and so on, there was a remarkable degree actually of support for a while, I think, for public spending cuts, because there was an easy narrative. We had this this financial crisis, everything was in a mess, we've got to do something about it. And you look at the 2015 election results, I mean, it's quite remarkable. I mean, the Conservatives just went to the population saying we're going to hit you even harder, and seriously, and that worked. I don't think that's where the country is now, because it's been going on for so long, because we haven't had the crisis, and of course we saw government doing so much through COVID and through the energy price spike. I think there may be more of a sense that this is
we like free money.
This is that the government should be able to do more. Now, is that a sort of big change in people's understanding of economics? I don't know, but I think it's a change in the understanding of a narrative, and obviously that's something that politicians are focused on, and I suspect we're still nowhere near good enough at.
Well, let me ask you a sort of follow-on to that. Has the Overton window shifted in terms of whether we'd be more likely now to accept tax rises or public spending cuts? I mean, what do you sense?
Some tax rises, populations have accepted without noticing. So we've had a 30 billion tax rise by freezing allowances and thresholds. That's a huge change. But other tax rises, and the employee national insurance rise, I think, went down less well than the government expected. I wrote.
That's a perfect euphemism. Look, we're still trying to find somebody who thought it was a good idea. Why is that? Please think me more.
I mean, I wrote a month or two ago in one of my Times columns about this being the 50th anniversary of the last time that the basic rate of income tax was increased. Back then it was increased from 33% to 35%, and all of the other rates went up, apart from the 83% rate, because if that had gone up, it would have taken the investment income rate to 100%. Even in the 1970s, that wasn't considered a good idea. So if you want to raise significant sums of money, you really are now in this quite hard place where if you want to, supposing the Chancellor wanted to raise another 40 billion, you have to look at things like that. And is the Overton window open for that? I kind of doubt it. And the pushback against what's this tiny change to pensioner fuel payments saves just over £1 billion. I mean, the political cost of that
So
is extraordinary.
is it silly? I mean, is it a waste of political capital to reverse the winter fuel payment, do you think?
You'd have to ask the politicians in the room about that. I think my guess is that unless it's done on quite a generous basis, then the feeling will still be that it's being taken away. But if it's done on a relatively generous basis, so for example, if you took it away from only higher rate taxpayers, I think Steve Webb's in the room, I think he calculated that would leave the government worse off because there's been a big increase in numbers of people who are taking up pension credit. So you could end up in this absurd situation where you used huge amount of political credit and actually left yourself worse off. Then you have to put it down at a much lower level, and then maybe you've still got a lot of the political cost associated. And I have to say, in the think tank world, I mean, we and pretty much every other think tank has always said, well, this is absurd, isn't it? This kind of winter fuel allowance that goes to lots of people on relatively high incomes, and you now see why the politicians up until now haven't done anything about it. I mean, it's worth saying, I think there's a lesson here. I think the person that Rachel Reeves ought to be very unhappy with is Gordon Brown, who introduced this, because once you introduce something, it's incredibly hard to get rid of it. And we see that in all parts of the welfare state. And again, it's very striking that nevertheless, I mean, it's just 2 years ago, Jeremy Hunt significantly increased the role of the welfare state in providing childcare subsidies. Now that's now in there forever, almost certainly, in a world in which the long-term pressures are huge. And we've still got the £10 Christmas bonus from 1973, I think it was, from pensioners. And the easier thing to do would have been to let the fuel allowance just kind of, it had been flat in cash terms for 15 or 20 years. So it's already only worth half as much as it was when it was introduced.
It sounds like what you're saying, Paul, is it's not what people are taxed, it's what they realise they're being taxed. I mean, is there just a massive gulf between the things that we're told about in budgets and the things that just quietly happen?
Well, I think there's a gulf in people's understanding about scale of things. So when you ask people about, how would you pay for more money on the health service, they say, well, let's cut MPs' expenses or something. When the difference between 200 billion and 20 million is, I quite understand it, because I don't understand interstellar distances. And when you're when you're living on 30,000 a year and people are talking about differences between tens, hundreds, and thousands of billions, it's very hard to get a sense of perspective. And when you look back at some of the last government, the last government increased VAT from 7.5% to 20% with no fuss at all, and that's a huge increase. And then they try and extend it to pasties, and the world's going mad. So I do have some sympathy. I mean, sometimes it's the electorate who are a bit mad, but it says very difficult, I think, for politicians, and again, particularly if you're in the Treasury. But this is where constituency MPs, I think, really do bring into the civil service stuff that us wonks just don't see.
You mentioned the black hole. We had Jeremy Hunt on the newsagents today, and
he wants to make Britain great again, doesn't he?
He does. He asks, "Can we make Britain?" He's very resistant of this £22 billion black hole, as you can imagine. How big is it? I mean, how big is the black hole?
Well, I hate talking about black holes. I mean, I'm not, as I say, good at astronomy. But so I think there's two things. The first is, in the run-up to the last election, as we said ad nauseam, it was obvious that there was a problem, that the next government was either going to have to preside over some pretty serious austerity from the off, or they were going to have to raise taxes, or they were going to have to borrow an awful lot more than it looks consistent with anything vaguely prudent. And of course, neither main party, or in fact none of the parties, were willing to engage with that. The specifics of the 22 billion black hole, and there's two big parts to that. One was funding public sector pay rises. Well, that was known that if you wanted to have bigger pay rises, you'd have to pay for it, and it wasn't funded, and B, at least to some extent, a choice. Though I think it would be very hard not. It'd be very hard not to do it. But that takes us back to the plans of the previous government were, I think, just not plausible in that sense. So I'm not got a lot of sympathy with the idea that was an unknown bit of the 22 billion. Got a little bit more sympathy with the other big bit, which was that the asylum costs were sort of hidden off the Home Office budget in a slightly bizarre way. Again, you could have kind of seen it. But I think actually the fact we're talking about this is actually a sign. It's like the 350 million pound on the bus. It's sort of the fact we're talking about this means it's been quite effective, because the big story was we knew that if you weren't going to have spending cuts, you were going to have tax rises.
So do you think it is duplicitous to keep using that number?
I don't think it's duplicitous. I think it's part of this narrative, and it's kind of, and some of these narratives are really powerful, and I don't think they're terribly honest. I think the narrative back in 2011 was that Labour crashed the economy, and it was all that. Well, it was a world financial crisis, and we had a big financial sector, and maybe we could have done something better in terms of regulation. But it really wasn't the last Labour government's fault. And I still, even last night, 2 days ago, had people going on to me about Gordon Brown selling the gold. I mean, it's kind of some of these things are just they're very, very good narratives which kind of work. But it doesn't mean that they've got much basis in economic reality.
It's interesting. Mel Stride, Shadow Chancellor, has been out today saying, basically trying to bury Liz Truss, saying whatever happened in the Liz Truss era, that was not us. That's not the Conservatives. We'll never do that again. She is not coming back.
Well, I'm sure that's
paraphrase, but Mel Stride sort of, and I guess this speaks to the whole question of narratives, right? Which is that Labour has been very successful at turning any Conservative suggestion on the economy into a Liz Truss problem. Give us a sense of whether is Labour right to say that everything we are seeing still now goes back to that fateful 6 weeks?
No, it was. This was just going back to that period in 2022, wasn't it? 2022, yes. Just a sort of small anecdote. So this is one moment when I thought I'd really put my foot in it. That I was on holiday that summer in August, and the thing about what Liz Truss did is that she did exactly what she said she did. She's a bit like Donald Trump. No one quite believed she'd do it, but she did. So she campaigned on the basis of these massive unfunded tax cuts for the leadership. So it was the Conservative Party who elected her, knowing what they were electing. I was on holiday with actually one of my sons. It's late in August, and one Sunday morning I got a call from a journalist at the Times. It basically asked, so what would happen if Liz Truss said what she'd do, did what she said she'd do? And I was relaxed. I said, well, she'd crash the public finances, wouldn't she? So the front page of the Times next day is Johnson says Truss would crash economy. And I thought, oh God, I hope my trustees are on holiday. but it turned out to be I was right. But
better if they'd listened in August.
But in terms, so that obviously had a really big negative effect in the short run. But unlike President Trump, it's relatively easy to get rid of our leaders.
Do you?
One thing I would say, one positive thing, about a year after that, the permanent secretary of a finance ministry in a sort of middle-income country came in to talk to us at the IFS, and he said that he wakes up every morning and thanks Liz Truss. And I said, what? And he said, well, what I say to my minister is, if that could happen in Britain, it could certainly happen here. So you do need to be fiscally responsible.
Yeah, you've got the blueprint. Do you ever worry about institutions being blamed for stuff that is very clearly political? Liz Truss went off the Bank of England, didn't she, quite quickly? Do you think that is a sort of growing trend or threat?
Yeah, I think I mean, yes, I do think it's a threat when you get this from a sort of populist perspective. Um, I think we do need to think quite carefully about how we oversee and make sure are accountable some of these very powerful institutions, um, and how politicians or others are able to say, for example, to the Bank of England, you know, we respect your independence, but we think you got that wrong. And maybe politicians can't do that, but maybe we need Institute for Monetary Studies to kind of to do this with some of what the bank does, because I think they would admit they haven't got everything right. And I'm not sure we've got quite the accountability framework we need. We should have for some of these independent institutions. That said, we're a much better country for the fact that we do have an independent Bank of England and an Office of Budget Responsibility. And particularly with the OBR, it's extraordinary the way that not just politicians, but lots of people will say, well, it's the OBR's fault that Rachel Reeves can't do this, that, or the other. Well, of course it isn't. I mean, it's her fiscal rules and her policies, and all they're doing is telling her. And generally speaking, they're being
You got competition.
former Shadow Chancellor's not keen on something. um, the, what was I saying? It's the
Well, the OBR.
the OBR is not responsible
to be fair,
for the fiscal.
They got their inflation rate wrong today, didn't they? And there is
Well,
often,
that was the ONS, and
well, it was the
yeah, I mean they've been getting the chairman's here. I mean, yeah, there's quite a lot of problems at the ONS at the moment.
So, I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense. Do you think that politicians don't have enough freedom, or do you think we should be protecting these institutions better?
I think they need protecting and nurturing, because I think they're incredibly important, but they also need to be accountable and I couldn't tell you exactly how that would work. We need to be really sure about the quality of the leadership and of the people and of the analysis and all of those sorts of things. I mean, the bank had the Bernanke review a year or so ago, looking really hard at why their forecasts hadn't worked terribly well, and we've had various reviews of the ONS. The OBR goes through a regular review cycle, and indeed, I think is very good at sort of looking back over its own record and concluding that it's generally been far too optimistic. Again, very different from the public perception, but if anything, OBR forecasts have been kind of helpful to chancellors. I think it's interesting looking where we are at the moment. I think if the Treasury had put out the sorts of forecasts the OBR has put out over the last couple of fiscal events, which are more positive than most other people's, people will be looking much more askance than they are at the OBR. So I think the chancellor should be really quite thankful that they've got an independent body doing this at the moment.
I'm very conscious I'm sitting between you and your goodbye drinks. So let us just wrap up, Paul, by saying briefly, what are you going to miss? What will you be happy to leave behind? Is there one top tip for Helen as she takes?
Oh gosh. I'm going to miss a lot. I'm going to miss, well, as you would have gathered, my colleagues, who, as I say, I think are just the most wonderful group of people. I'll miss Richard for the second time. And the culture of the IFS. I'll miss being on the Today programme.
You won't. You'll come back.
So yes, I'll miss an enormous amount, and it's a huge wrench. But I do think it was the right time to move on, both for me, because I think I was getting a bit stale, at least in the sort of running of the IFS, and for the IFS. I mean, Helen's already showing more energy and new ideas and so on, which is hard to do when you've been in charge of a place for a long time. You can't suddenly say, well, let's, I certainly, so I think it was the right time for me, and particularly the right time for the IFS. And I'm just delighted that Helen's doing it. I mean, just don't mess it up. It's
Fine.
I mean, what's the? I mean, the negative bits is we are, and I mean, I've probably bored everyone in the room silly about this, but we're seen as a national institution, but we run like this just to survive because all of our money essentially comes from bidding for grants from the SRC and the Nuffield Foundation, heads of both of which are here. Thank you. And other places. I mean, I think people have this sense in their mind that we're quasi-governmental or sort of, we've been around since the 17th century or something. But we're an institution which exists by happenstance, really. And one thing I have done. Let me boast about this. When I took over, we had 3 weeks running costs in the bank. We've now got 6 months. So Helen, again, you're really lucky. But actually that pressure of funding is hard. But also, and I don't think this is just me reassuring myself that it's another thing that makes us as good as we are, because we have to be good in order to get the money. And I think if you've my new place, if you've just got the money in the bank, then you can get a bit lazy, can't you?
Don't knock it. Paul, a personal thanks, and from many of my colleagues, we've just loved having you there at the end of the phone on the airways. It's been an incredible gift that you've given us, really. So thank you, and thanks to everyone for coming tonight.